I rented the hunting cabin in Maine because I wanted solitude. Winter had already settled hard over the forest, the air sharp and heavy, the trees stiff with ice. The cabin was small, a single-room structure with thick log walls, a tin roof, and a short chimney puffing smoke when I kept the wood stove going. There was no electricity, no running water, just a cot, a table, a few shelves with rusty pans and mismatched cups, and a lantern I kept filled with fuel. I wanted a place far from anyone else, somewhere I could hunt during the day and sit by the fire at night with nothing but the sounds of the woods around me. That first evening, I fell asleep listening to the fire pop, the wind dragging across the trees, and the deep stillness that seems to swallow sound in a winter forest. The kind of stillness that presses against your ears until the smallest noises stand out like they don't belong. It was well past midnight when I woke. The fire had burned down low, the cabin dim, and at first I couldn't figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, faint scratching. At first I thought it was the wood in the stove contracting, or maybe a branch shifting under the weight of snow, brushing against the cabin wall. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, longer, steadier, a dragging scratch that seemed to move just behind the wall where my head rested. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a porcupine trying to gnaw at the logs. I had heard stories of that before. Even squirrels sometimes chewed at cabins. The idea made sense, and with that thought, I closed my eyes again. The sound came once more, faint but deliberate, then stopped. I drifted back into uneasy sleep. The next morning, light pushed through the frosted window, and I went outside to chop more wood. The cold was biting, the kind that stings your nose and stiffens your hands through gloves. The snow around the cabin was untouched, clean, and even no tracks. I rounded the corner toward the back wall, and my breath caught. There were marks on the logs, not scratches at the bottom where animals usually gnawed, but gouges. Deep, deliberate gouges etched into the wood about 6 feet off the ground. Too high for a raccoon or porcupine. Too high for anything but a bear standing upright. But even then, they looked wrong. Not the swipes of claws. They were long, straight lines pressed deep, almost carved. I stood there a long time, staring at them. The air felt heavier than it had when I'd first stepped outside, like something had shifted. I looked at the snow again. No tracks leading to the cabin. No marks in the powder below the wall. Just the gouges, clean and sharp in the wood. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake it off. I went into the trees with my rifle, moving quietly, the cold crunch of snow under my boots the only sound. I looked for signs of game, tracks, scat, broken branches, but the woods felt still and empty. By late afternoon, I headed back, dragging my legs through the deepening snow, my thoughts pulling again toward the cabin. When I reached it, I went straight to the back wall. The gouges were still there, catching the low light, their shadows long and black. I tried not to think too much about it, tried to focus on the normal tasks. I split more wood, stacked it near the door, cooked a small meal on the stove. By the time darkness came, the unease hadn't gone away. That night, I lay awake longer, listening. The wind moved through the trees outside. The stove breathed in soft huffs. But under it all, I strained for that sound again. Hours passed. My eyes were just starting to close when I heard it. The same scratching, faint and deliberate. I stayed still, every muscle locked. The sound moved along the wall, slow, steady, like something dragging a hard object across the wood. Then it stopped. Silence pressed in again, thick and absolute. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I forced myself to check the wall. New gouges had appeared, fresh, biting deeper into the logs than before. They were clustered near the others, all at the same strange height. Again, no tracks in the snow, no sign of anything coming close, just the marks. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the wood had split in the cold. Maybe there was something I wasn't seeing. But deep down, I knew better. They weren't cracks. They weren't natural. They were deliberate. The days that followed turned into a slow unraveling. Each morning, more gouges appeared. Each night, the scratching returned. Always faint, always dragging, always in that same place above my head while I lay in bed. I stopped sleeping. I sat up by the stove, rifle across my lap, lantern lit, waiting for the noise. Sometimes it came early, sometimes in the hours just before dawn, but it always came. I checked the snow around the cabin again and again, searching for proof of something. But the surface stayed unbroken, smooth as if nothing had touched it. The forest around me grew heavier with silence. Even birds seemed absent, no tracks of rabbits or deer near the trees, no rustle of movement in the underbrush, only stillness. The gouges spread wider across the wall. They grew deeper, cleaner, sharper, as if whatever made them was patient, returning night after night to work at the wood. I ran my fingers along them once, and the cuts were so deep I could feel the splintered edges sharp under my skin. At some point, fear turned into a kind of dull acceptance. I stopped trying to explain it. I stopped trying to chase it away with reason. Instead, I just watched the wall, counted the marks, and waited. But the moment that broke me came near the end of the week. I had been dozing lightly in the chair, rifle across my lap, when the scratching started again. My eyes snapped open. It was louder this time, more forceful. The sound scraped hard enough that dust fell from between the logs inside the cabin. My breath caught in my chest. Then it stopped. I sat frozen, my eyes fixed on the wall. Slowly, the silence grew thicker. Minutes passed. The fire cracked once, startling me. Then, faintly, I heard something else. Not scratching this time. A slow exhale. On the other side of the wall, right where the gouges were, something was breathing. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The sound was faint but steady, controlled, like whatever was out there knew I was listening. Then, after a long moment, it faded. Silence returned. By morning, the gouges were deeper than ever. My decision came quickly then. I couldn't stay. Whatever game I'd planned to hunt, whatever solitude I'd been looking for, none of it mattered anymore. Something was out there, and it wasn't leaving. I packed fast, stuffing my few things into a bag, my hands trembling as I shoved them into place. I left wood piled in the stove, the fire burning hot, almost as if I wanted to pretend someone else might need it after me. The snow was falling harder as I started down the trail, rifle slung over my shoulder, pack digging into my back. The trees loomed close, the forest dense and quiet, the weight of it pressing against me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something tall and still standing near the cabin, watching me leave. I didn't. The woods stayed empty, but the feeling never left. It followed me down the trail, clung to me through the long walk back to the truck, stayed with me even as I drove the narrow road out of the forest and back toward town. I never told anyone the full story. If I had, I doubt they would have believed me. A man alone in the woods, hearing scratches, finding marks. They would say I was tired, that the cold and isolation had gotten to me. Maybe part of that is true, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Those gouges weren't made by any animal I've ever known, and they weren't an accident of weather or wood. They were deliberate. Something came to that cabin in the night. Something tall, patient, and careful. Something that worked slowly, day by day, marking the walls just above where I slept. And the worst part is not knowing what it wanted, or what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I had been hunting out of that cabin in Oregon for years. It wasn't mine. I leased the land from a family who owned a big spread up in the hills, but I'd fixed it up enough to make it comfortable. A one-room place, nothing fancy, with a wood stove, a table, and a bunk against the wall. It sat tucked into a clearing a few miles from the nearest logging road, surrounded by dense fir and pine that seemed to press closer every season. When I'm out there, my days are simple. I wake before the sun, drink coffee brewed on the stove, and step out into the cold to watch the tree line come alive. The forest in those parts feels endless, all steep draws, thick underbrush, and the smell of damp earth. I've always liked that kind of solitude, the kind where the only sounds are your own boots in the dirt and the creak of trees swaying above you. It was early November when it happened. The air had that sharp bite before snow really settles in. I left the cabin after breakfast with my rifle slung over my shoulder, planning to hike toward a ridge I'd scouted the day before. I moved slow, careful not to make much noise, eyes scanning the ground for fresh sign. A couple of hours in, the terrain dipped into a narrow drainage, and that's where I saw it, the truck. At first, I thought it was just another old rust bucket abandoned in the woods. You see those sometimes, left to rot after logging jobs ended decades ago. But as I came closer, the details pulled me up short. It was a pickup, probably from the late 80s or early 90s. The paint eaten away by time and weather until only patches of red clung stubbornly to the metal. The body was pitted with rust, the tires half sunk in the dirt. But the driver's side door was open, swung wide like someone had stepped out just moments earlier. And then I saw the prints, fresh boot prints, dozens of them, pressed deep into the soft earth around the truck. They circled back and forth, some leading toward the trees, others back to the truck, overlapping and crisscrossing until the ground looked churned. I froze. My eyes followed them into the brush, then back again. Whoever had made them had been here very recently. The edges were sharp, no signs of weathering, no leaves drifted into them. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old. I called out once, instinct more than anything else, my voice strange and too loud in the stillness. Nothing answered, not even a bird stirred. The woods around me felt suddenly heavy, the silence pressing down. I walked slowly to the truck. The inside was stripped bare. No seat cushions, no dash, nothing but metal bones left behind. The steering wheel hung crooked, cracked down the middle. It looked like it had been sitting for decades, whether chewing it away. That didn't fit with the prints. None of it made sense. I crouched, studying the ground. The boots had a distinct tread, deep-lugged, maybe a logger's or a hiker's. The tracks didn't show panic, no long strides like someone running. Just steady movement, back and forth, as if the person had been pacing or searching for something. But there was no person, no pack, no gear, no sign of anyone leaving the area. The prints simply wandered into the trees and faded. I stood there longer than I should have, unease prickling the back of my neck. The forest around me stayed silent, not a branch cracking, not a crow calling. The stillness felt unnatural. Finally, I pulled myself away. I marked the location in my head and started back toward the cabin, but my focus was gone. Every shadow between the trees felt too deep. Every sound I made seemed louder than it should have been. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out of the woods behind me. When I got back, I shut the cabin door and dropped the bar across it, something I rarely bothered with. The fire burned low in the stove, but I didn't feel the warmth. My thoughts kept circling back to that truck, the open door, the prints that had no ending. That night was long. I lay on the bunk, rifle propped against the wall within arm's reach, listening to the creaks and sighs of the cabin settling. Usually those sounds comfort me, reminders that the place has stood through worse storms than I'd ever see. But that night they kept me awake, each one carrying the edge of something else, something I didn't want to name. When dawn finally came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I thought about leaving right then, hiking out to the truck, and driving to town. But part of me couldn't shake the curiosity. Hunters are like that. You spend enough time in the woods, and you learn to read the signs left behind. Tracks, scat, broken branches, they all tell a story. I wanted to know what story those boot prints told. So I went back. The truck was just as I'd left it, the door hanging open, the interior stripped. The prints were still clear, though some edges had softened from the morning frost. I followed them into the trees, slow and careful, rifle in hand. The trail twisted through the underbrush, looping back on itself, doubling over in strange patterns. Whoever made it hadn't gone far, just circled and wandered like they couldn't decide where to go. I followed for maybe 100 yards before they stopped entirely. One set of prints ended at the base of a tree, and beyond that, nothing. Just undisturbed leaves and pine needles. I stood there a long time, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of it. A person doesn't just vanish in the woods. Even if they climbed the tree, there should have been broken branches or scuffs on the bark. There was nothing. The prints simply stopped. A chill worked through me then, deeper than the cold of the air. I turned back, moving quicker than I wanted to admit. For the rest of the trip, I couldn't shake it. I kept hunting, but my mind wasn't on it. Every time I stepped into a clearing, I scanned for another abandoned truck, another set of prints. At night, the forest outside the cabin felt less like a place I loved and more like a place holding something back, something I wasn't meant to see. When my time was up, I hiked out, loaded my gear into my truck, and drove straight to town. I stopped at the small ranger station and told the man there what I'd seen. He listened, nodded slowly, and said they'd look into it. But there wasn't much else to say. People went missing in those mountains all the time. Some were found, some weren't. I left it at that, but the memory stuck. Months later, I tried to find the spot again on a map. I could picture the drainage, the slope, the angle of the sun when I came upon the truck. But no matter how I traced the terrain, I couldn't pinpoint it. I went back once in spring, hiked for hours, searching, but I never found the truck again. No rusted frame, no open door, no boot prints circling in the dirt. Just forest, endless and indifferent. That's what stays with me most. I know what I saw. I know I didn't imagine those prints, fresh and sharp around a truck that hadn't run in decades. I know the door had been open, like someone had stepped out only moments before. But the woods swallowed it whole, like it had never been there at all. And maybe that's the truth of it. Out there, people vanish. Machines rot. Stories fade. The forest keeps its secrets, and once in a while, it lets you glimpse one, just long enough to remind you how small you really are in all that space. I still hunt from the cabin, though I stay closer now, never wandering as far as I used to. When I sit by the fire at night, I think about those prints circling the truck, the way they stopped without warning, and the silence that hung heavier than any silence I'd known before. And I know this, whoever left those tracks never came back for that truck. No sign of them was ever found. We thought the Smoky Mountains cabin would be the perfect weekend getaway. There were 6 of us, all friends from college who hadn't seen each other in a while. Someone found the cabin online, advertised as private, rustic, tucked into the trees with just enough amenities to feel comfortable without losing the sense of being far from the world. It looked good in the photos, and when we drove up the long, winding gravel road, the place matched what we'd expected. The cabin sat on a slope with a small porch that faced out toward the dark tangle of mountains. Behind it, the forest pressed close, thick with pines and bare hardwoods. The air had a sharp bite, that damp chill of the mountains at night. There were no other houses in sight, no traffic, no lights anywhere beyond the glow of our own windows. For a group of people who lived most of their lives surrounded by noise and movement, the silence felt like a novelty at first. Inside, it was cozy enough. A wood-paneled living room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with mismatched dishes, a narrow hallway that led to 2 bedrooms and a loft with extra beds. We brought bags of groceries, beer, and enough firewood stacked by the door to last through the weekend. By the time the sun dipped below the ridge, we had a fire going, music playing softly from someone's phone, and the easy rhythm of friends slipping back into old habits. The first night passed without trouble. We stayed up late, the fire painting the walls in orange light, laughter echoing in the small space. Eventually, we scattered to the beds, the cabin sinking into quiet again. Outside, the woods were so still it felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The second night was different. We had spent the day hiking, following a trail that wound up through ridges and down to a cold stream. By the time we made it back, all of us were sore, tired, and ready to sink into the warmth of the cabin. Dinner was simple, just food cooked in pans on the stove, eaten with plastic forks off paper plates. The fire burned steady, and the mood was calm, heavier from the exhaustion of the day. It was near midnight when it started. I had gone upstairs to the loft, stretched out on the thin mattress, my body aching from the hike. Below me, the fire still burned, and I could hear the others moving around, the creak of the floorboards under their feet. My eyes were just beginning to close when a sound cut through the stillness. A faint rattle at the front door. At first I thought it was one of us, maybe someone stepping out to get something from the car, but then I heard it again. The sharp click of a handle being tried, turned, tested. Not fast, not frantic, but slow. Someone was checking the door. I sat up, heart thudding in my chest. From above, I could see the glow of the fire and the front door in shadow. The handle moved again, a metallic scrape as pressure turned it back and forth. Then silence. I held still, straining to hear. A moment later, a soft tapping came at one of the windows. Not a knock, not a branch brushing in the wind, but a finger or something like it, tapping lightly on the glass. Once, twice, then moving, sliding along the side of the cabin until it stopped at another window. Another tap. The mood in the cabin changed instantly. Everyone went quiet. The fire popped, and that sound alone felt too loud, too normal against the wrongness of what we were hearing. Footsteps crunched faintly in the leaves outside. Then another door handle rattled, this time at the back. Whoever it was, they were circling, trying every way in. My mouth went dry. I stared at the windows in the loft, their glass black with the reflection of the firelight. All I could think about was someone standing just outside that glass, staring in, hidden by the night. The noises went on for what felt like forever. A slow process, deliberate, as if whoever was out there wasn't in a rush. Handle, pause, tap, pause, movement. They weren't running, weren't shouting. They were just testing, feeling out the edges of the cabin, waiting for something. Eventually, the noises stopped. The silence pressed back in, heavier than before. Minutes ticked by, but I couldn't bring myself to lie down again. I kept staring at the dark glass, half expecting to see a face pressed against it. I didn't sleep much that night. None of us did. Every creak of the building, every groan of the timbers in the cold, made me tense. I kept waiting for the sound of glass breaking or the weight of footsteps on the porch, but nothing came. When morning finally arrived, the relief was almost dizzying. In the daylight, we checked outside. There were marks in the dirt near the porch, faint impressions of shoes, not boots. A trail of scuffs leading around the cabin, toward the back door, then disappearing into the trees. No deep footprints in the mud, no clear path, just the evidence of someone having stood close, right where we'd heard the noises. The reality of it sank in heavy then. Whoever it was hadn't been lost. They hadn't been a hiker looking for help. They had been trying every way into the cabin, moving from door to door, window to window. They had been waiting for one of us to leave something unlocked. We cut our trip short. None of us wanted another night there. We called the sheriff on our way out, more to report it than anything else. He listened, then said something that made the whole thing worse, not better. He told us it happened sometimes up there, that squatters, drifters, and people living rough in the woods would stalk cabins, especially ones they knew were rented by tourists. They waited until night, tried the handles, tested the windows, hoping to catch people sleeping so they could get inside without a fight. That thought stayed with me long after we left. The idea that while we had been stretched out in our beds, eyes closed, breathing slow in sleep, someone had been just on the other side of the wall, fingers on the glass, hand on the handle, waiting for the chance to step inside. The drive back down the mountain felt endless, the narrow road twisting through the fog and trees. I kept glancing into the woods, the shadows between the trunks, imagining figures moving there, watching us leave. When we finally reached the highway, the relief was real but fragile, like it wouldn't take much to shatter it. Back home, the story became something we told cautiously, in half-laughs, as if saying it out loud too seriously might make it worse. But at night, when I'm alone, I sometimes think back to the sound of that first rattle of the handle. The slow, deliberate way it moved, not in frustration, not in panic, but in patience. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were looking for a way in. And if one of us had forgotten to lock a door, or if the glass had given way under their hand, they would have found it. That knowledge has a weight I still carry. Because once you've heard the sound of someone trying every door, every window, circling your cabin in the dark while you sit frozen inside, you never forget it. I remember the cabin more clearly than I wish I did. When my girlfriend and I booked it, it seemed like the perfect winter escape. Remote, tucked deep in the Rockies, small and simple, with no distractions other than the heavy snow that pressed against the roof and the pine trees that stretched endlessly in every direction. We wanted quiet, and we got it. But the silence of those woods became something I will never forget, because silence can hide things. Silence can mean something is waiting. The cabin itself was basic but charming at first glance. A single story, wooden walls darkened from years of weather, a small porch that looked out over the tree line, and inside a living space just big enough for 2 people. There was a wood stove against one wall, a narrow bed pushed up near the single back window, a kitchenette that barely fit a fridge and stove, and a bathroom no larger than a closet. It felt like a place built more for hunters or hikers passing through than for comfort. Still, when we arrived, we were happy. The long drive up the mountain roads had been tense, the snow getting heavier with every mile. But once we unloaded our bags and started a fire in the stove, I remember feeling grateful for the seclusion. The first couple days passed quietly. We went for short walks in the snow near the cabin, careful not to wander too far since the drifts were knee-deep in some places. We cooked simple meals on the stove, drank coffee in the mornings, and sat by the fire in the evenings with blankets pulled tight around us. There was no TV, no internet, no phone signal. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional thump of snow falling from a heavy branch. At night, the darkness outside was absolute. The windows turned into mirrors, reflecting the glow of the fire and our own faces back at us. It was the 3rd morning when I noticed the prints. I had gone to put more wood on the fire, glancing absent-mindedly toward the front window, and something in the snow caught my eye. At first I thought it was just marks from an animal, maybe a deer that had come close during the night. But when I stepped closer, my stomach tightened. They weren't animal tracks. They were footprints, human footprints, barefoot. The snow was deep enough that each step was pressed clearly into it, the toes spread and distinct. Whoever had walked there had circled the cabin, literally walked a ring around it. I followed the line of prints with my eyes and saw that they came right up to the windows. One set led directly to the glass, toes pointed inward, as if someone had leaned close to look inside. The first thing I felt was disbelief. My mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was old, maybe they were ours somehow, though we hadn't stepped outside without boots since arriving. But the snow was fresh, falling all through the night. These prints sat clean and sharp on the surface. No snow drifted into them, no melt, no signs of age. They had been made after we went to sleep. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The cold light of the morning pushed against the glass, and all I could think about was the fact that while we had been asleep inside, someone had been out there, barefoot, circling us. The thought of bare feet stuck in my mind. The snow was not soft. It was biting, numbing cold. The air temperature at night had dropped well below freezing. No normal person would have been out there without shoes, not unless they were desperate, not unless something was deeply wrong. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I walked around inside the cabin, checking the doors and windows. Everything was still locked. Nothing was broken. There were no signs anyone had tried to come in. But that gave me no comfort. If anything, it made it worse because it meant they hadn't wanted to break in, they had only wanted to watch. The rest of that day stretched long and heavy. I found myself jumping at every sound, even the natural ones I'd been used to. The creak of the roof under snow, the whistle of wind around the chimney. I kept checking the prints, watching them through the glass, making sure they didn't multiply, making sure nothing new appeared. By afternoon, clouds rolled in, and more snow began to fall. Slowly, the footprints softened, the edges blurring as flakes covered them. I thought maybe I'd feel better once they were gone, once the white swallowed them up, but the opposite happened. The more they disappeared, the more I felt uneasy, like the snow was erasing proof of something I should never forget. That night, I hardly slept. Every time the fire popped, I opened my eyes. Every time the wind rattled the cabin, I sat up and listened. In the mirror black of the windows, I imagined a face pressed against the glass, watching us again, waiting for us to fall deeper into sleep. The next morning, I got up before sunrise and went to the window again. My chest went tight when I saw it, fresh prints in the snow. Another circle, another path leading to the windows. This time the snow was still falling lightly, but the prints were sharp enough to see they had been made not long before dawn. Something was very wrong. I couldn't deny it anymore. Someone was coming to the cabin at night, barefoot, circling us, watching. My mind spun with questions I couldn't answer. Who could it be? How had they gotten there? We were miles into the mountains with no other houses nearby. We hadn't seen a single car on the way up. For someone to be out there, without boots, without even a flashlight, it meant they either lived wild in those woods or they wanted to scare us. That day, I forced myself to act normal, but inside, panic kept spreading. I checked the woodpile outside in the daylight, forcing myself to step into the snow. I wanted to see if the tracks led anywhere. They didn't. They circled, stopped at the windows, and then disappeared back into the trees. No sign of a camp, no fire pits, no belongings, nothing. Just the deep silence of the forest swallowing everything beyond the cabin. By evening, I was restless, pacing the cabin, every muscle wound tight. The firelight flickered on the wooden walls, shadows jerking with every movement. I thought about leaving, packing up, and driving down the mountain, but the snow had thickened, the roads would be dangerous, and part of me kept hoping maybe it would stop, that whoever it was would just leave us alone. But they didn't. That night was the worst. I woke in the dark, my heart already pounding as if I had heard something. The fire had burned low, the room dim, and in the silence I swore I could hear something outside. Not footsteps exactly, but a faint crunch, like weight shifting in the snow. I couldn't bring myself to go to the window. I just lay there listening, every nerve alive. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off again. But when morning came, I felt the dread before I even looked. The prints were there again, fresh, circling, closer this time. Whoever it was had stood at more of the windows, pausing at each one, leaving deep, pressed impressions in the snow where they had lingered. That was it. I couldn't stay. My mind kept returning to one fact. The person outside hadn't tried to get in yet, but there was no guarantee they wouldn't. Watching us could only last so long before it turned into something else. We packed in silence, stuffing our things into bags, my hands shaking. I carried them to the truck, each step outside feeling like a risk, like at any second I'd hear movement in the trees. I kept scanning the forest line, looking for a figure, but it stayed still, blanketed in snow and silence. When we finally got in the truck, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The tires spun at first in the snowpacked driveway, but then caught and we crawled down the mountain road. My eyes stayed fixed on the rearview mirror for miles, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind us, barefoot in the snow, watching us leave. We never saw anyone. We made it back to town, to the low hum of traffic and lights and the comfort of people moving around us. Later, when I told a ranger about it, he didn't have much to offer. He said sometimes people lived rough out there, off the grid, and not always in their right mind. Sometimes hikers got lost, wandered in strange ways. But barefoot, in that cold? Even he shook his head at that. I've thought about it more times than I want to admit. Those footprints weren't a mistake. They weren't random wandering. They were deliberate, circling, watching, night after night. Someone was out there in the cold, with no shoes, no light, no sound, just waiting outside a cabin in the woods while we slept inside. And the worst part is knowing that if we had stayed one more night, maybe the footprints wouldn't have just stopped at the windows. Maybe they would have led to the door. I had rented the cabin for a week. It was in the northern woods, far off the main road. And when the man handed me the keys, he warned me about how remote it was. He said there wasn't much cell service, and the nearest neighbor was a good 5 miles down a dirt road that most people avoided after dark. That didn't bother me. I had gone there to be alone, to get away from the constant noise and motion of the city. I wanted silence, space, and the kind of stillness that only a place buried in the trees could give me. The cabin was simple. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a living room with an old wood stove, and a porch that faced the thick forest. The walls smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The floorboards creaked when I walked over them, but I liked the sound. It was a reminder that the place had been standing there for a long time, weathering storms, winters, and everything else nature threw at it. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, set my food in the small fridge, and stacked some wood by the stove. I took a short hike behind the cabin to where a narrow trail disappeared into the trees. I didn't go far. The forest was thick, and the shadows came early. By the time I returned, the sun had dropped low, and the cabin seemed swallowed by the growing darkness. That night, I sat on the porch listening to the forest. It was mostly quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the far-off call of some bird. The second day was much the same, peaceful. But the third night is when things started to change. It was late, maybe close to midnight, when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just a deer moving through the brush, but the sound was too heavy. It was slow, deliberate, like weight being shifted from one step to the next. The cabin sat about 3 feet off the ground, and I could hear the faint crunch of soil under each step. I froze in bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, holding my breath. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped by the porch. I waited, my chest tight, expecting to hear the creak of the boards, but there was nothing, just silence. After several minutes, I convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe even a black bear wandering through. I tried to sleep, but it took hours before my body calmed enough to drift off. The next morning, I went outside. The dirt around the cabin was disturbed, pressed down in places that looked too large for deer tracks, too wide, too long. The prints almost looked like a human foot, but elongated, with a narrower heel and deep claw marks cutting into the soil. I crouched down and studied them, my stomach twisting. They weren't like anything I had seen before. I told myself it had to be some kind of animal. Maybe a wolf, maybe a large dog from one of the distant farms. But the size of those tracks didn't make sense. They were far too big. That night, I built a fire in the stove and sat in the living room reading by lantern light. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the branches against the roof. Sometime after 10, I heard the sound again. This time it came from the tree line. Slow, steady steps. They moved closer, stopping and starting like whoever or whatever was out there was watching the cabin. My mouth went dry. I turned off the lantern and sat still in the dark, straining to listen. The steps came to the edge of the porch, and then the boards groaned. Something heavy was on them. The weight shifted, moving closer to the door. The knob rattled once, softly, like a hand testing it. My skin went cold. I didn't move. I sat there in the chair, every muscle tense. The knob rattled again, then stopped. There was a slow, dragging sound along the side of the cabin, like claws scraping against the wood. I wanted to grab the axe by the stove, but I was afraid the sound of movement would give me away. After a long time, the boards creaked again, and the steps moved back off the porch into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I checked the porch. The boards had fresh scratches across them, deep enough to cut into the wood. The door frame had marks around the knob, long and sharp. They looked like claw marks. I stared at them, trying to process what I was seeing. A bear might scratch, but not at the doorknob. A wolf might pace, but not rattle the latch. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I decided to stay inside the rest of the day. I kept the windows covered, and every so often I would glance outside. The forest felt wrong now, too quiet. Not even birds moved through the trees. By late afternoon, I had the sense I was being watched, though I couldn't see anything. That night, the sound returned. It was bolder this time, heavier steps, circling, then pacing directly across the porch. I heard breathing, low, rough, animal-like, right outside the door. Then a thud against the wall. Not a scratch, not a brush, but a heavy strike, like a shoulder or body hitting the side of the cabin. Another followed, then silence. The silence was worse than the sound. It stretched out so long that I began to wonder if I had imagined it. I sat there clutching the axe in my hands, staring at the door, my ears straining. Then something moved to the window. I had left one curtain half open, and in the faint glow of the moon, I saw a shape. Tall, broad, hunched forward. The head was wrong, too long, with pointed ears standing up, and eyes that caught the faint light like an animal's. They reflected pale, yellowish, and unblinking. I froze in my chair, unable to breathe. The figure lingered, pressed close to the glass. Then it moved, slowly, back into the dark. I stayed awake until daylight, every nerve in my body frayed. By morning, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't spend another night there. I packed my bag and loaded the truck. The dirt road back out was long, and I was afraid of it, but staying felt worse. Before leaving, I walked once more around the cabin. The tracks were everywhere now, huge, deep, circling in loops. Some led into the trees, where the undergrowth was bent and crushed down like something massive had forced its way through. The ride down the dirt road was nerve-wracking. Every curve seemed to hide something. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure chasing me. The forest seemed endless, every shadow thick with threat. When I finally reached the main road, I felt the first hint of relief. Civilization was still miles away, but the road felt safer than the cabin. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small town with a gas station. I parked there and just sat, my hands shaking on the wheel, trying to slow my breathing. I never went back for the rest of my week. I handed the keys back early, telling the owner I had to cut my trip short. He asked if everything was all right. I nodded, but I didn't explain. Even now, I can see that face at the window. Too tall, too wrong, too animal to be a man, but too close to a man to be an animal. I don't know what it was, but it was real. The scratches on the porch, the prints in the soil, the sound of it circling in the dark. They were all real. And I know this. If I had opened the door, I wouldn't be here writing this.